Hello, everyone. Welcome to what may possibly be the last episode of the War Report before the missiles rain down upon us, because it's apparently coming to that now. I may be exaggerating, I may not be. We'll address the question of what nukes are actually capable of, or the question of should nukes even be a consideration in this a little bit later down the line, but of course, we are in day 5 of the Russian invasion of the country of Ukraine. Now, something I have noticed, and I'm sure we can blame the internet, the primary, well, the only way you're actually listening to this, that people seem to believe that if war is not won within 6 hours, it is definitively won or lost for one side, and ignoring that wars take the course of years. Again, we're a people, an era addicted to fast, instant gratification. The idea that a war might take several years to win is completely out of the realm of possibility for others, whether that be because of a fast forward button or because of time lapse or because of any of these things. But fundamentally, the the attention span, let's say, of most people has gone down the drain. Think about how quickly we moved from the last narrative, which was the convid stuff, into this one, and think about all the stuff that we had before that, and think about how short of attention spans people actually do have when it comes to these sort of things. So you have a lot of people eager to say, because Kiev didn't fall within 6 hours, once again, that Ukraine has won, or that Russia will be within Kiev by the end of the week. And they're ignoring a lot of the context for this. Somebody compared it
Yeah.
to historical invasions throughout the 20th and 21st century, bringing up the invasion of Poland, which took about a month, the fall of France, by the time the Germans actually broke through French lines in World War II, was also about a month. The Russian war in Georgia, of course, as we always reference, was about 11 days, and the advance into Baghdad by coalition forces in 2003 took about 3 weeks, and it also took about, well, I believe it was 42 days to eject Iraqi forces from Kuwait during the first Gulf War with overwhelming air power. So people are realizing that even in lopsided wars, it can take several days. And I would say this is a lopsided war, and we'll get into some of the items and some of the things that Ukraine has done that just reek of desperation. And not to mention, of course, we also have the so-called peace summit and negotiations ahead of us. Some news about Belarus, and just an overall covering of it, the European Union's role, and the new sanctions. A lot of this, once again, we're not going to get into the nitty gritty of the battlefield, or, of course, because of YouTube policy, we can't really show any images of that. But once again, I'll say, like we said last episode, we're not going to give you a beat by beat report of these things. We're just going to be covering the topic overall and the implications of said topic, and, of course, the future speculations. And I actually want to, again, delve a bit more into the sanctions, because I think a lot of people are overlooking those in terms of the entire narrative compared to the war itself, which admittedly does draw in people's attention more because it is a much more active event, it's a much more active setting for a lot of people, and it's easier to keep their attention. Again, going back to those short attention spans. But I do think the sanctions and the economic decoupling of Russia and the West even further is worth addressing. And once
Mm.
again, trying to find the answer to that $1 million question: how much pain will Europe tolerate for the American empire? Because it seems like, at least in these initial days, and of course these things can take weeks, if not months, if not years, that Europe seems to be tolerating quite a bit of pain for the American empire. Now we'll see how that actually plays out once, again, the consequences of their actions, the consequences of their sanctions set in. But there'll be plenty to discuss about that moving on. So I believe the comparison was that Russia covered about 120 kilometers in the day out of the invasion into Crimea. Again, not to get into too much detail, and also one of the things that makes reporting on nitty gritty details hard is the Ukrainian Defense Ministry will put out about a dozen and a half claims of varying degrees of true or false, whereas the Russians are very tight-lipped about this. They'll let almost nothing slip out. They will tell you very little, which you would think that's how you should conduct a military operation. Have very high OPSEC, have very high confidentiality. Again, not let soldiers have their phone, which is apparently something people were Russia for. Whereas Ukraine, at this point, and it's understandable seeing as their role in the situation, is very focused on fighting a propaganda war, whether that be from the Ghost of Kiev, who shot down this mysterious Ukrainian ace, who shot down about 109, 110. There's that number again. Russian aces and is single-handedly carrying the Ukrainian Air Force. Turns out to not exactly be real, if not a complete fabrication. Of course,
It
the
was
Snake
Sam
Island
Hyde.
story about their brave defiance, telling the Russians to F off before getting blown to bits. Turns out those 13 brave men were a facility of 82 who surrendered upon arrival of Russian fleets. I will also say, editor's note, Snake Island is rightful Romanian territory, but that's beside the point. I do feel very passionately
Here
about
we
that,
go.
but that's our catering to the Romanian audience. And I will get into, speaking of Romanians, some of the news about the other minorities in Ukraine at this time and how the conflict is affecting them and the nations that they are respectively the diaspora of. Mainly, again, Hungarians and Romanians are the big two there, but there's a couple other groups that are worth addressing as well. But the war continues, not in Ukraine's favor, I should say. Zelensky was able to get himself a fast track membership to the European Union, which I can only imagine spurns many of these other Eastern European countries that had to pour years into selling their country down the river to Brussels, whereas Ukraine gets to. They haven't been, of course, accepted yet, but they got to fill out a fast track application, something that took several countries years to even get to the application process before there was even consideration. Now, will they be admitted into the European Union? That's anyone's guess. Surprisingly enough, the U.S. realizes, despite the poll numbers, despite 42% of Americans saying that if sanctions are ineffective, we should break out the nuclear weapons. Hence the title of today's episode, "Duck and Cover." I was proud of myself for that one.
Mm.
I was like, believe it, I was actually surprised we had not used it before, even though I'm trying to think back of the number of nuclear scares that we've had since the beginning of the show. It escapes me at this time, but I can get back to you on that if it's really that important to you. But with that being said, it looks like the Americans, beyond the normal, beyond the sanctions, beyond aid shipments, is pretty uninvolved. You have Biden make his statements, but Biden has fulfilled his role of absentee president and has been very quiet about this. A lot of the action so far has been coming out of other European countries in the European Union when it comes to that with Russia, more so acting on the American empire's behalf, which isn't really a surprise outside outsourcing these wars and outsourcing these imperial foreign policy objectives to client states of the empire, whether that be, again, some proxy group in the deserts of Syria or the European Union itself. Or we'll see how things proceed in East Asia, and we may see, say, Japan or South Korea or a number of these different countries take up a similar role vis-a-vis China. And people are speculating already at this point that the fall of Taiwan is only a matter of time. Now, we'll get into that a little bit because I do think that's a bit premature to talk about, and it's also not a one-for-one comparison. But I do want to get into some of the, again, Ukrainian desperation that we alluded to towards the beginning of the show. So, all fighting age men, which they define from ages 18 to 60, have been barred from leaving the country, where, of course, any males below or above that age range are let out, along with all women, of course. So they are seeking refuge mainly in bordering countries such as Poland is the big one, but also Slovakia and I believe even Romania as well. So they are coming in there. I do think it's interesting that they aren't the European Union, the Western media isn't quite sure what to do with this refugee narrative because these are, again, European peoples, but they're also refugees from a Russian war, so-called Russian war of aggression at the same time. So they find themselves in a bit of a dilemma. They're not entirely sure how to spin the narrative about the refugees in particular. But on top of that, of course, Ukraine has issued about 25,000 small arms, mainly rifles, as well as other explosives, hand grenades, rocket launchers, to civilian populations, which, no surprise, Many of the areas where that happened have devolved into gang wars between these previously existing gangs. It's turned into a lot of turf wars, not even necessarily forces fighting each other. You had Ukraine approve fast track visas, or I believe they at this point they've even scrapped the visa system for any foreign volunteers who would like to come to the country. The Dutch officially sponsored foreign volunteers from their country to go fight in Ukraine. So, despite Ukraine winning the propaganda war, despite them claiming that they've claimed the same amount of casualties that America took in both Iraq and Afghanistan combined within 5 days, and that they've downed 100 tanks and that they've downed several dozens of aircraft between both helicopters and fighter jets, it does seem like, of course, Ukraine is winning that propaganda war, but in terms of the actual war, it does seem if they're scraping the bottom of the barrel. Hence the so-called negotiations today, which we'll get into later, that took place in Belarus, even after Belarus
Hmm.
announced that it wanted to join in on the Russian operation.
Yeah, I mean, there is so much that is going on. I I should acknowledge that, the last episode that we did, we were saying certain cities, they were already taken, and that was based on the kind of info that we had available at that time. And I think of all the wars, this has got to be, it is the one that the fog of war is the thickest on so far. And, there could be all kinds of reasons why that was. Part of it is just to demoralize the enemy, make the enemy think like, oh my God, how are they everywhere at the same time, and so on and so on. And after a few days have gone by, that 120,000 troops along Ukraine's border. Well, that's not really how many have gone in, and it's more like 40,000 have gone in. Now, I would say by the time this show airs tomorrow, which will be Tuesday, that number will go up. And so other waves will happen. There have been legitimate setbacks for the Russians in this. You have fairly typical stuff. Um, Units that move too fast and outpace their entire logistical line, and so they run out of gas, and then they're stuck, and then they're sitting ducks. That has happened. The degree to which that has happened, I think, is questionable. I think it would be very easy to fake some of this stuff because, of course, I mean, Ukraine is saying 4 to 5,000 dead a day, right? It's all those based grandmas in Azov that are doing it too.
You know, planting
It's
sunflower seeds on the corpses, as we know. And again, who knows if that story is even true? Where a lot of this is just word of mouth. And then the other thing to consider that you brought up as well is that there's also been a considerable degree of restraint because, unlike say in Iraq or a Libya, the goal isn't the destruction of the country. Now it's the neutralization of the country with possible integration or say, puppeting of much of the country. People are expecting some annexations again. We've speculated on that as well. We don't know the exact plan when it comes to that, but I can only imagine that Russia's trying to leave a lot of the civilian infrastructure intact in order because they don't want to have to rebuild that after the war again. It's not just this complete war of attrition, not this complete shock and awe. So people have said that they have been very restrained. Not to mention, there's the one video of the convoy just following basic traffic rules and letting cars go through at the intersection. And you can tell these are the part of the Russian convoys because they do have the Z painted on them, which has become the symbol
Yeah.
of the Russian forces in Ukraine at this point. So again, it's a very I wouldn't use the word
Yeah, I mean,
casual, but it's a
you can
very
always add that paint job,
yes,
right? Like
it's fair,
it's because
fair.
they're using. Okay, I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, but it seems so far with everything that has come out, despite the idea that these are like the second coming of the Mongols that are just pillaging everything. It
Mm.
seems like, all things considered, especially compared to, say, the Iraq War, is the comparison a lot of people have been making, that this seems to be a very restrained operation so far, which does make me question what the exact goals are. What does make me question the end game here. Speaking of end game, there's plenty of Cape Ship references to be had that we will certainly get into when we get into the propaganda war side of this. But with all that being said, it's, as you said, the fog of war has been the thickest out of any conflict that I think has been covered within the so-called information age, the age of the internet so far. And I'm really not sure what to make of it. I'm cautious to make judgments on either side thus far, but I can say definitively that Russia isn't losing. It's not like the troops are about to march back and overthrow Putin because of how disastrous this war has been, considering the fact that it's 5 days old. And I said upon this initial invasion that if this were to be the downfall of Putin or anyone else, it would be a very long term consequence rather than a very short term consequence. And I think that because of the way the media cycle works, because of the way that the general public follows stories, everyone is stuck in a very short term mindset. Now, I'm not saying we're immune to that. We've certainly fallen into that trap before. But that seems to be the main stumbling block when it comes to analysis, from my observation at least.
Right, and it's very important that you set up in hindsight, when the U.S. State Department was saying Kiev should fall in 96 hours, like when you think of what the logistics really are, here's a country that is twice the size of Iraq. No, there is still internet, there is still heating, there is still water, there is still gas. None of those things have been taken out, which were taken out in the invasion of Iraq 2.0. Furthermore, it took America 17 days to reach the outskirts of Kiev, and then it took them 3 weeks total to to take Baghdad. But it took them 3 weeks to take um, Baghdad itself. So really, I mean, on the third day, from one end, they had already reached Kiev. Now, with all these limitations, there is, for instance, a standoff, and probably the place where the Kiev regime has enjoyed the greatest amount of success has been in Kharkov. This is a city sort of, I would say, halfway between. It's, yeah, I guess it's between Kiev and Lugansk, um, on a diagonal line, and it's Ukraine's second largest city. I believe it's about roughly 1.5 million people. The Ukrainians are, yes, they are hiding. Um, they're using the landscape of the city to hide, often around schools. That's true in Mariupol as well. And that's true also when the fighting. So a unit, an entire unit did get, and there was one with five that's in custody. There's been some torture. In respect to the Russians, I have not seen, I've seen several videos, and none of the prisoners look like they're being tortured. No one looks happy, but they're not being tortured. And they're on camera, so they're wondering, like, what's going to happen. Technically, under the Geneva Convention, they shouldn't be, their faces should not be revealed. The Russians did get around that by getting them to wear masks because of COVID, of course, but not so with the Ukrainian side. So there have been significant losses. The Russians claim it's around 270 or so. I would say it's probably even a little higher than that. Um, I would think also that any further push forward is not due until probably Thursday. And some of that is because their traffic that contains gas and other provisions are in huge jams right now. So there is a kind of a clogging, whereas first they outpaced them, and now there is a clogging for them to try to get in. Um, I should say, however, that Mariupol now, for instance, is actually surrounded. Pravi sector got in there as well. Azov was already in there. And then you have other scenarios. You have a kind of a cauldron, which is an encirclement. Uh, the Russians call encirclements cauldrons because of the cauldron. And then, the water starts boiling. When they start bombarding, the ground will look like it's boiling, so to speak. So they call it a cauldron. And there was a very interesting case because Pravi sector also showed up in the Donbass area. And the Russians kind of left the Donbass. They had a few skirmishes and they gunned it for Kharkiv. Now, what this has done is it's allowed the Ukrainians to still shell towns like Gorlovka, and two teachers were killed, and there was another older man that was killed, I believe yesterday. But this is kind of disappointing. In any case, both Lugansk and Donetsk have been able to ride past these areas. They're about 50 kilometers further west now than they've ever been before, not since 2014 when they held Slavyansk briefly. So it's going to be very hard to take over these areas because the policy with the Russians is no aircraft, no artillery. So it's going to be, mano a mano, so to speak. And I believe, and I could be wrong, but I believe that there's a reason for that. One is, uh, I think that this is supposed to impress Zelensky and to get him to capitulate. The argument, of course, is can Zelensky actually capitulate? Is he actually in charge? Because he has changed his mind several times on this. So obviously, Zelensky is a U.S. puppet. So he has to, he kind of has to go with what Washington says.
I mean, but
And
arguably it goes a little deeper than that because you have to keep in mind the man has no political experience. He was a comedian, he was a TV star before getting into any of this, so many of his decisions are likely just at the behest of whoever is advising him at the time, whoever is whispering into his ear, telling him what the best idea is, because he's simply a man in over his head that has no business in the office.
right, and so I think that so yeah, sure, but at the same time, he can't instigate anything. Not really. I don't think so. If he does, he'd say, he's not really safe with the Russians. So in a sense, he's safer listening to whatever the Americans say to a degree. I think there's a point where that won't be the case. Um, but I think the other reason why Putin is doing this is he does want to build on this, you know, of a kind of knighthood and a kind of self-sacrifice, even large numbers dying for this has a religious, semi-religious, and even esoteric significance for Russia, historically speaking, especially for those in Russia who are more minded this way, right? In the West, it's about efficiency, right? Oh my God, I can't believe how many men they lost. I mean, they won, but look at what cost, right? And there is a point to that. A Pyrrhic victory can be a total loss in the end, anyways. But World War II was not a Pyrrhic victory for the Russians. There were times it was close, but I think this, like, they're not in that kind of material state of mind in the way the West is. The West is already in that mode of efficiency. That is what technocracy is. It's about ever more efficiency. And I think Putin, maybe because he's older, maybe there's several reasons. I think that line of thinking in Russia is still stronger. So in other words, it's going to cost us a lot of lives to take over these areas. Yes, we are giving advantages to the Ukrainians in a way that no one else would. But we cannot prove that we're their brothers without doing this. That's the point of the sacrifice. We're willing to take higher losses than they are, which is always the case when it's like defender versus attacker in an urban setting. But we're willing to do that because, yes, it is about the victory, but this is a very specific victory. Had this been, let's say, the Germans or somebody else, no matter how less sophisticated the Russians were, they were still going to do it. They were going to do whatever it takes to win. And but in this case, that's not the case, right? So that's why we're moving into day 6, just at the beginning. I guess it's about 3 or 4 a.m. there. Well, there's still not, everybody still has, now, food is another matter. Food is going to become a really big problem. There's already um, shootings in Kiev, there's already gangs being formed. I don't know how big this is, honestly, but I have seen some videos where that is happening. There's even looting in stores in areas of Lugansk and Donetsk that, for the first time in 8 years, have been liberated. And so there are real problems like that. But in terms of like water, heat, internet, which allows the disinfo to go on and on, all those amenities are still there, right? Russia has not taken them out. Of course, America did take all those things out when it bombed Serbia for about 80 days consecutively. So Russia will not do that, and it will not do it particularly for the situation in Ukraine, because they have to play a much like the outcome, and the way of the outcome is absolutely crucial for posterity, right? These men will be lionized. They will be made heroes for this extra sacrifice. That will be there. That will resonate for a very, very long time. So it will not be about efficiency. Efficiency cannot inspire the same way,
Well,
right? And particularly in the,
going back to what we were saying uh, an episode or two back was this isn't so much as an invasion of a foreign country from the Russian perspective, but a putting down of, say, rebellious brothers, where when America does storm into Iraq, or when Russia is at war with, say, Germany, or again, when you're fighting an ostensibly foreign people, you're willing to pull less punches, you're willing to be, again, that more efficient about it, victory by any means necessary. Where in this case, it seems that there's still that acknowledgement that these are our people, these are our brother people, and we don't want to obliterate them simply because of the circumstance, and we are willing to be more honorable about this, and we are willing to even incur a greater sacrifice if need be.
yeah, I mean, and it's kind of lost in some ways, even with Ukrainians that are well aware of it. Last week, I spoke about my Ukrainian friend who told me the night that the invasion started, and um, I told him, like, so he had one of these fake videos of everyday Ukrainians had caught a saboteur, and it's literally just like another Ukrainian guy in civilian clothes. And this is I'm saying this is like 3 days ago. Like 3 days ago, the Russian forces were not that well into Kiev, and a lot of the main like whatever mayhem was happening out of a kind of a deep paranoia and anxiety that had gripped the city. Obviously, I mean, there are hundreds of thousands that are fleeing the country. There are men who do not want to serve in this war, uh, between 18 and 60 and so on. And so, I said, so I told him, I said, they're not like all the, like, have you noticed like all the CNN and BBC videos, people, in down in the subway or in parking lot garages. I go, they all have internet. They all have lighting. I go, none of this has gone out. Like, I go, they're trying to do the least amount of damage. Because, yeah, I know, but you gotta love that Cossack spirit. Like, this guy always signals like very lib positions, but for the first time, like finally he's become like a bit of a neocon. Because I get it. It's his people, it's his country. So I can appreciate that. But I just thought that was so funny. And so I mean I decided to elaborate because in a way he would send me stuff and it was like honestly, it was very cringe stuff. It's like this is a old video of a group of people beating up this guy in his 20s. It says saboteur, but like, have you seen like what happens in small towns when they catch somebody that's been stealing? They grab them and then they wrap them around a tree and stuff. And this now they weren't doing that to him; they had him pinned to the ground. And I just decided, like he needs a history lesson because if he doesn't, he's going to keep sending me stuff in my, in my private messages on one of the social medias that I'm on. And I just thought like I can't deal with this. And I said, I want this war. I said I'm more or less neutral on this and I want this war to end as quickly as possible. Because I also have anxieties about what could happen if this war goes on. We'll talk about that. And I said, for the record, Ukrainian nationalists joined the wars in the Balkans, including those in Kosovo. And I said, we left Yugoslavia. When the war broke out in Kosovo, we took in tens of thousands of Albanians from Kosovo as refugees. We let the Americans park their fighter jets that bombed Belgrade for 80 days, essentially. And the thanks that we got from the US for all this help and capitulation was that now these Albanians that we had helped, and there were other mercs that were. I remember reading a story because there was a friend of mine who was there um, in Kosovo just after the war. The just around the time that the war was dying down, and he's a photojournalist, and so I'm reading articles and stuff, and there were Croats and also some Ukrainian nationalists that fought for this, right? And I said, when I go back to Macedonia and I have to go to the small town that I'm from and get my passport stamped, this big photo, this big picture with all these little photos of all the policemen that died. Because in 99, you don't know this, but in 99, our capital nearly got overrun. And we have to deal with Albanian terrorists, less so now, but often, more often than you would think. You will never hear about that in the West. So I said, I can't, I can't help you with this. Like, I know you're excited, talk to other people that enjoy your enthusiasm, but like, you're not going to get it from me. It was the Ukrainian government that gave us 2 helicopter gunships, which actually made the difference. But it was not the Ukrainian nationalists. There's the difference. So, I just thought it was important that he hear that he understand that, because he's really like, I mean, the stuff he was sending me, it's like, dude, this didn't happen. Snake Island, like, are you for real? And I didn't want to say it to him because I know he was extremely emotional and his feed had all the then he's at a protest and he's got signs made and like, I mean, it's a very popular thing, right? Like Madonna, that Palestinian porn actress, David Rothschild, Soros, all these people are like going, oh my God, we have to help Ukraine.
The best people in the world have all rallied
Steve's
behind Ukraine.
the best people support this. Steve Bannon encouraging people to go. The UK, you mentioned Denmark, encouraging men to go and die for global homo. I love this shit, right? Like, I witnessed the last 6 years memes of American GIs, or whatever Western soldier storming a beach, fighting in World War II, with the caption above, um, "These men didn't die for tranny reading hour and mass migration," and it's like there's an implication that we're never going to do this again, and then you have like people on the right who are going, no, this is different. It's actually it's not different. It's not different because even if like, so what? You defeat Russia. You're the Ukrainians have already lost everything. Like, they are a global homo country now. It's over, right? There's no hope. You're not going to save them. As I said, years back when this war started, and I was speaking to some of these Ukrainian nationalists, and I would tell them, I said, you know what the Americans are like. You know what they stand for. I know you're not like that. Why are you doing this? And his literal reply to me was, well, yes, of course, we know all this, but in time, they're going to need us, and when the time will come, where we will reverse this on the Americans. And then, like, he was like one of these real nut jobs that, like, yes, of course we're going to win Ukraine, but later we're going to march on Moscow. Like, that level of stupidity, like, really, really that dumb. And now I'm the leader of these groups. I'm sure are like Pravi Sector and Azov. They're probably more pragmatic than that, but that is like their constituents. You'll find some that do think that way. So I never forgot the conversation I had with one of these guys. And so I guess what I'm saying is, because I saw a lot of streams this weekend, and there's a lot of pushback on guys like Keith Woods and Joel Davies and other people who are streaming about this. They're furious. They're furious about, like, oh my God, how could Putin use the Chechens against them? Blah blah blah. Even though, like, Chechens, I've been following this war since the first days. I've been following it even before.
Yeah,
Like,
they were some of the first Ukrainian volunteers. So few of the first to
yeah,
actually go fight against the Donbass.
Chechens and Ukrainian nationalists worked together in bombing public places in Russia. Like, what are you talking about? They were both together in the war in Georgia in 2008. Like, what are you talking about? You guys work with Chechens as well, right? But you have Westerners like, he's the he's the guy that looks like he's aspiring to be a model for the cover of a Harlequin romance novel. The Swedish guy, what's his name? Oh, the golden one. The golden one. When he found out about the Chechens, he says, "That's it. Putin is not based." Like, come on, dude. For you, Putin was never based. And then you have other spurgs in our community.
Well, yeah,
Putin isn't.
I think yeah,
Putin's not Hitler, so therefore I
it's
can't support him.
it's weird that, like, okay, now we are the last people to be speaking about this, the last people to be lecturing about this, but it's weird that so many Western right wingers have such an investment in this conflict that it is
Yes.
the bellwether of civilization. When, again, looking at
Yes.
the point I've heard just on the American side is like, well, look at the crisis on our border right now. Look at the
Yes.
next migration wave about to come in. Why do we care about centuries-old Slavic conflict, which is somewhat the mindset I'm of? But again, you have a lot of Western right wingers who are either committed to telling you that Putin is the last hope of the Western white man, or that he is are going to be our
Nobody is
final
that.
destruction.
That's a fallacy. That's a fallacy. Nobody is saying that.
Yeah,
Nobody is saying that. Nobody's creating content that he's the white savior. Literally, nobody is doing that. As soon as you talk more objectively about this, like if you're objective about Russia wanting security, that's what they'll accuse that you're saying. But literally, nobody is saying
yeah.
that.
It's
No one.
yeah. Again, I'm framing their arguments.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Settle down.
Sorry.
So I'm gonna take. Look, that happens again. I'm gonna take you out behind the barn, and you know what happens then. You know what happens then. Um,
Yes, yes, yeah. What's his name? Corn Pop. I'll
yeah,
have
yeah,
to
yeah.
deal with
You're,
Corn
you're,
Pop.
you're gonna get the corn pop treatment, but again, you have this, and as I was saying last episode, you have this actually greater effort to debunking something that very few, if any, people have actually said. But my ultimate point I was getting at is you have so many Western right wingers who think that this is going to be the battleground on which our fate is decided. Strangely enough,
It's
on
like Trump election
yes,
again.
like on this Ukrainian side, and I can't wrap my head around this, and I'll maintain the position I said last episode, the episode before that. I'm certainly not happy that this conflict is happening. It's entirely the fault of NATO, and Russia is more or less justified in what they're doing, at least in a broad sense. Maybe you can find some specific example of, say, war crimes or misconduct among Russian troops or Russian commanders, whatever. But again, the general premise seems to me that Russia is completely justified within within its operation here. And again, I still maintain that this is a broader conflict regarding the fate of
Yeah.
Europe, as I was saying the other day, and that Ukraine is simply just a foreground for this, or foreground to funnel a lot. And again, I'm not saying us, internet commentators are the most influential people. But I'm talking about people who actually do have influence beyond us.
Yes.
It's to funnel that energy into focusing on this, albeit tragic conflict, versus the fate of Europe and having them recapitulate to the American Empire, because it does seem as if a lot of European countries, it's not the entire European Union with a few dissenters here and there, are going along with these sanctions and ever increasing these sanctions. And I mentioned before, there were some comments made. Apparently, the Russian Foreign Ministry blamed it on some talking head within the White House that they started this whole hoax about Russia being on high nuclear alert. But that came from the story that allegedly Belarus gave Russia permission to house their nukes there. And before I get too much in the European thing, I want to address the nuke question. Now, I do not subscribe to the theory that nuclear weapons are just this big fake, that there's something that's made up, that Hiroshima and Nagasaki were just really elaborate fire bombings. I don't buy into that. I believe that these weapons more or less do exist. But what I will say is these are weapons that are built around the premise of not using them, and built around the premise of being a deterrent. So it does raise the question. This is something that each side has accused the other of for years, that their nuclear arsenal is out of date and ours needs more funding to be up to date. It does make you wonder how much money and how much maintenance are actually put into these weapons, and how many of these weapons would be operational in a hot conflict. And I really couldn't say, but I suppose that's the point. It's supposed to keep that ambiguity about it, the fact that these may work, these may not work. But again, that arguably makes the situation more dangerous than, say, a conventional war, because you're putting all your eggs in one basket at that point. You're looking at the situation and you're playing with weapons that, were to believe the official reports about, had the capability of causing the end of civilization itself. Now, again, are they actually that powerful? We don't know. We've seen what tests do. We've seen Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but that is such a limited scope of information compared to all other weapons we've had. And also keep in mind, to my knowledge, now correct me if I'm wrong, these are the only weapons that don't really get wargamed. Everything else in the arsenal of these countries, whether that be tanks, planes, ships, whatever, those all get wargamed. Those all get deep speculation on their capabilities. We see some of them in action sometimes, especially with the past 20 years of American wars and invasions, and again, just the past 20 years of American foreign policy, I'll put it that way. But of course, we don't have that sort of information on the nuke for obvious reasons. And it does raise a lot of questions. And again, some people are speculating, is this a second Cuban Missile Crisis? The Russians actually alluded to something of the sort before the conflict even broke out. And again, it's an interesting question to speculate on, again, because we don't have that much information about it. And
Yeah.
we're basing this on, honestly, talking points from before the Cuban Missile Crisis when it comes to any discussion of nuclear war. Maybe some talking points from the 1980s, but at the end of the day, the real question is, and I suppose we'll learn this if anyone ever calls the other side's bluff, is, are these weapons even what they're cracked up to be? Are these weapons even operational?
Mm-hmm.
What is the real size of the Russian nuke arsenal? What is the real size of the American nuke arsenal? What's the real size of the Chinese nuke arsenal? People are bringing up this security agreement from, it was a few years back, that China guaranteed the territorial integrity of Ukraine with its nuclear umbrella. Now, how true that is and how true that would actually hold up, again, I doubt China is going to risk an exchange with Russia of that sort over the territorial integrity of Ukraine. I simply don't see that happening. You
No.
can reference back to our previous discussions on Russian-Chinese relations, but it does add this. If you, the fog of war was as thick as it could be already, but it does just add that extra layer of fog on top of that afterwards.
Right. And I think also, this is another instance where, you saw it, especially with COVID, but it was there with Ukraine Gate, Russia Gate. Everything became like an avenue for people to vent out their hostilities, to vent out all kinds of absurd, anti-vaxxers they should be put into camps. Now they're saying, they should be conscripted. Um, so I think,
That's a real. I you bring that up. I do want to talk about the unhinged liberal class, and I have quite a bit to say about the
yeah,
American establishment's reactions. But it is rather bold of them to suggest using bioweapons on Ukraine.
yeah, I know, and I think everybody, and you see it on the right as well. Like, they're like they look at a kind of a narrow angle on this, and they get all passionate about it, and it's I don't know. It's like I keep saying, there is a real civilizational crisis taking place. Um, I think every scenario has been thought of before Putin did this. And he's doing this because he perceives that there's a weakness in the civilization. It's there. It's very real. And nonetheless, though, the propaganda is extremely effective. People get really wired up about it. But if it leaves the news cycle, it will die down very quickly. So a lot of it, there's this enormous interaction with the media, and people, I think, deep down inside. I mean, even when the Ukrainian government admitted that Snake Island was just nonsense, they themselves debunked it. You had people tweeting like, "Well, okay, so what? It wasn't real. The point is, we have to help these people, and they need morale support and all this kind of thing." Right? But then what you've got like a public that has gone insane, right? You have like 42% that are saying that if the sanctions don't work, we should use nukes. Now, in no way does it mean that American elites are going to do this, obviously, right? But then you have about 58% that are saying if the sanctions don't work, then America has to get militarily involved. And of course, the reason for that is because this event, like Afghanistan, is another moment of humiliation, and it is driving people insane, right? And you even see the development of like a kind of a template for um, bringing together the opposing forces in the cultural war together. So you have conservatives, right wingers on the one side with libs and progressives on the other, and all the bickering about the culture wars. Well, you can both agree about Ukraine, right? Now, with many right wingers, and I am not saying that these are influencers in the right. Most of the influencers on the right who are extremely popular, Academic Agent, Joel Davies, Keith Woods, Eric Stryker, who has been the most salient during this whole time, Pinovich, uh, and the list goes on and on. Most of them are like much smarter than their audience, but they're you can see in the on some message boards and in comments and whatever, there is a proportion that like they will compartmentalize the whole thing. They will say, okay, but Azov is based, even though it's doing this. Again, they have no plan how they're going to reverse this. Like, how is Azov going to eventually subjugate the US? Like, it's the same kind of thinking of Al Qaeda or any of these other jihadists who think like, yeah, we'll work with them, but eventually, we'll overrun them. Well, you won't. It won't work. So I find that funny, and then you have like really retarded takes like, well, I'd rather fight with I'd rather cheer on them than the commies. It's like there's no commies here. None of them are commies. And like, I mean, if there's a word on the right and the conservative spheres that's overused, is commies. It's cringe. It doesn't move the needle. I'm not advocating for debate because I think we're long past that. All of this hype is really, again, it's just a way to cope with the much bigger issues of a slow decline.
And you brought something up, especially about the support of Ukraine. It has created much similar to Zionism with a
Yes.
lot of American conservatives. This living vicariously through other nationalistic groups because it
Yes.
is something
Yes.
that is simply either A, not allowed, or never going to take off within the
Yeah.
states, where, again, they can channel this into an approved form, similar to how, again, you get a lot of this on the left wing side as well, where they'll channel a lot of their frustrations into this LGBTQ CIA stuff, where, again, they'll channel it into the rainbow flag or the trans rights or the whatever, where it is just this funneling of genuine energy that, may be good, may be bad, into something that is ultimately irrelevant to us over here. And
Mhm.
with the way it, of course, plays out, it usually doesn't end well for us. But it is just this. Once again, they want to supplant this focus on what has been broadly termed a culture war into the idea that, okay, it's, we've had our fun, we've had our playtime, but it's time to get serious about national unity. And I remember there was one blue check mark who said something that's like, I may not like Putin, but I don't hate him as much as the Democrats who want to indoctrinate my kids or whatever. And then there of course was some as Twitter interactions do, some liberal blue check saying, well, that won't happen, and then third party intervenes saying, well, I guess I support Putin then, and then it's just a tirade by the blue check saying, you're exactly what's wrong with this country. Well, we don't have national unity. It's
No,
it's
yeah,
it's
I
it's
know.
one of these really stupid Twitter exchanges, but again, I think it encapsulates the point that like it's piss on you all day, it's spit on you, it's all these various things. But when it's time for the vaunted national unity, you're the first one that's expected to fall in line and capitulate
Yeah,
on the
yeah.
culture war issues. And this gets into, in terms of American domestic politics, this whole we need to put country over party thing, where that usually means you submit to the narrative and abandon all your ideals for the good of the so-called country at that point. And again, it is this. It both makes me optimistic and pessimistic. The fact that people aren't getting a sense of national unity about this. The fact that I've said previously, I don't think there's anything that could garner that sense of national unity. But also, beyond people who are even somewhat buying into this nonsense, it doesn't seem like it has created that sense of, oh, we're all just one, and these people suddenly don't hate my guts and want my kids indoctrinated or whatever. So that is somewhat reassuring to see that even if people are buying into a lot of the war propaganda about how Ukraine must valiantly stand against the new evil Soviet Union or Russian Empire or whatever the narrative deems it to be,
Yeah, yeah.
that even then, even if they do give that passing support to it, it still seems that instinctually it's secondary, if not tertiary, to them. And speaking of blue checks, it is amazing. Something I've talked about before, not necessarily on this show, but just in general, is the infantilization of American culture. The fact that we're all perpetually 15 years old, and that really probably one of the worst effects of the American education system is that very few people ever leave high school. The mentality gets stuck with that of a 16 or 17-year-old child. And I think that is best encapsulated in the idea that, again, all the pop culture references that Putin is like the like the bad guy from the Cape shit movies, and we're like the good guys. And Zelensky, we have Captain
Yeah.
America, but Zelensky is Captain Ukraine. They have this Photoshop of him
Oh, I
like him.
saw that.
I'm
My
pretty sure I,
goodness.
I I sent that to you. And again, even beyond that,
Yes.
just the mythological figures like the Ghost of Kiev or the Snake Island Defenders, where it becomes this thing that is straight out of a Hollywood script that the American mind has been effectively colonized by Hollywood and its agents, where
Yes.
they have no realistic understanding of the world. It's always the triumphant heroes against the irredeemable villains. There's no sense of nuance. There's no sense of anything. Even though they like to think that because they watch these things, they have this higher understanding of morality and how the world works. And then, of course, the politicians pander to that. The bureaucrats are run by people with that mindset. So it is just this real cape shitification of the narrative in those terms. And they look at this, and again, they think they're so damn clever every time. They think they are so clever every time they bring something like this up, every time they make a pop culture reference, every time they make a Harry Potter reference or whatever. But I will say to you, there is one acceptable reference to make, fictional reference to make in the terms of this conflict. So you plebeians can have your Harry Potter references, your plebeians can have your superhero or Star Wars references, but us true intellectuals, we see the striking parallels between this and the lore of the Ace Combat series, which I would certainly recommend. I say that semi tongue in cheek, but funny enough, there actually is quite a bit of similarities if you get into the lore of the Ace Combat games between
I'm not
what's
I'm
what
not familiar.
um, I would certainly recommend. I don't know how much of a gamer you are, but for anyone in our audience who's ever played, and I know there's a couple of you, I know one of you especially is all over it. He actually introduced it to me. I won't give away his name because I don't know if he'd want me to or not. But yeah, he pointed this out to me that yeah, there's a lot of similarities between that and Ace Combat. But it is interesting the idea that these javelins and that these anti-aircraft missiles that are about 40, 50 years out of date that we're providing to the Ukrainians are just going to down these state-of-the-art high-tech Russian fighters when they there's been videos of these Russian fighters, I believe they were the Su-35s, just striking off these missiles or taking fire damage in places where it wouldn't damage the aircraft and still keep it in operation. So again,
Yeah, well, I
it's
mean, there was that early on, they had a Russian jet downed, and then like more video and photos came out, and you can tell from the turquoise blue color of the sheet metal that the unfortunate thing that happened is that a Ukrainian jet was downed, but it was still used, as propaganda that they took down a Russian jet. And again, I'm not minimizing. There have been significant and even humiliating losses for the Russians, but I think overall the Russians feel that given 5 days, the amount of loss is still less than 100 a day. It's still a lot, but it's more on the Ukrainian side. But I mean, I don't want to, that's neither here nor there,
well. One last
honestly.
thing I will mention about propaganda and the cape shitification of the world. Something I actually found quite amusing that a U.S. lawmaker and actually several American politicians fell for the Sam Hyde meme. They found some way to make his name sound more Slavic. I can't remember the exact translation they used,
Oh
but it
yeah,
was
yeah, yeah.
Adam
That was
Kinzinger, that
hilarious.
Huke out of Illinois. He's a congressman who's allegedly a Republican, but is like completely in line with the regime. Every social issue he's trying to out liberal the liberals on. But yeah, he tweets out that, and again, it is amazing that even in times like this, that just really stupid jokes and hoaxes like that still manage to make their ways up to the highest echelons of society. So that's one thing
Mm,
I do appreciate seeing.
right. Yeah, yeah, definitely. Um, I think you know, I think I've lost my train of thought, actually. Sorry, forget
Train
it.
has been derailed for many years at this point. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. No, I had a point that you started with on the not necessarily the Cape shit, but just the nature of the propaganda itself, beyond the idea of just building up of the morale. The way it's so simple minded, right? The West right now does suffer a kind of like you can tell in many ways, like they know, like many of them already realize that they know it's not true, but it's very, very, very important to believe in it. You do have a sense of a kind of growing religion. It's not defined. um you don't know exactly what the rules are, who's the figurehead, like you don't quite know, but it's there. And I think it was there during COVID as well, but it's more so now, where they know it. And it was there during the Floyd riots as well. I mean, the last 2 years have been really unbelievable, right? The embrace of propaganda, uh, even like sometimes self-acknowledging that it's not true, but that there is a greater cause behind it. This kind of creation of a new mythology for the West. I think that's something to keep track of. That's very interesting. Uh, uh,
Yes, the civic
for
religion is ever
for
expanding,
what's
and
going to be.
even when these narratives contradict each other, they're still incorporated into this broader civic religion. Now, for lack of a better term, you could almost call it like pagan or a folk religion in structure, where again it's just these amalgamations of all these different things that we're supposed to believe into one centralized ideology or again state-backed cult, if you will. But again, it is fascinating to
Right.
watch unfold in a society that has been thoroughly deracinated and removed of any real religious or metaphysical or philosophical concepts for the past 50, if not more years.
Right. And I suppose we should also, talk a little bit about the sanctions, the strategy for Russia moving forward, and the implications for America in the West.
Well,
And
I'm glad you brought that up because I
yeah.
heard while we were recording the show about the most crippling sanction they've imposed on Russia.
Hmm.
So, the Walt Disney Corporation has said they have suspended any future film releases in the nation of Russia. So, that
Thank you.
will.
Literally, thank you.
Yes. And then, on the similar vein, several European countries have expelled Russian nationals, particularly students from universities. Once again, thank you. And that's also funny when you consider the constitutional referendum in 2020 that put restrictions on people who've held foreign residence working in either government or elected office. So you
Yeah.
do have these things where they are inadvertently supporting Russian goals, and you could argue with the university class. Perhaps they know exactly what they're doing. They're sending a class that will have massive discontent for the government back inside its
Mm,
borders. I wonder where we've heard that one before. Certainly doesn't ring a bell at all. Now, I'm not saying, of course, it will come to that, but it is slightly reminiscent, if I do say so myself.
yeah.
But the main one that has started now. Okay, we'll start with the meme one, actually. Uh, Several U.S. states have removed Russian vodka from the shelves. So
Freedom fries.
yeah. So it looks like it's only a Polish vodka from now on. So for those vodka
No
enthusiasts,
commie vodka anymore. Thank God.
so either weep or rejoice, depending on your personal taste there. And again, maybe if you can find a dumpster outside of one of these locations, assuming they didn't pour it out already, which they probably
Yeah.
did, you might be able to score yourself some free Russian vodka. You've seen the moves that we discussed last week to decouple Russia from SWIFT, and it looks like that Switzerland has gone forward with those proceedings, as well as
Except they didn't have the guts to go for the real big enchilada, right?
yes, yes. And once again, you saw the small rebellion among countries like Germany, Italy, Hungary, and Cyprus. Monaco, another famed tax haven, even though the real big tax haven for Russia is Cyprus, has moved forward with the European Union imposed sanctions. And you've had, of course, several countries go along with that as well. And more countries, including Canada and the U.S., are banning the import of Russian oil. Now, you'll know, for those of you who've watched this show for quite some time, that for the past 3 years, ever increasingly, the U.S. imports more Russian oil. Each
Yeah.
year is a greater
Each
amount
year
from the
breaking
X.
the last. Yeah.
Yes, and that will only lead to, again, the halting of the American energy industry with the stopping of issuing of drilling permits and also the refusal to renew them. So you can only expect domestic energy prices to go up. And that's not even getting to the question of European energy prices, where they are almost completely dependent on that. Because it looks like if the United States really wanted to, if we had an administration that really wanted to, we could issue those permits again. We could somewhat stabilize our internal energy situation. But
Hmm.
I don't have a feeling it's going to happen under either Biden or the possible succession of a Kamala presidency.
Right.
But
Good point.
the
Because like
Europeans don't
the
even
need
have
for
that
it may
options.
may come. Go ahead.
But what I was getting at is that many European countries don't even have an option akin to that, where if there is enough pressure put, if things do get bad enough, the American government can't capitulate and reboot its American energy industry, its domestic energy industry.
Right.
But a lot of European countries do not have that luxury. Particularly Germany does not have that luxury. Where it. The real question is, I will bring it up yet again: how much pain will Europe tolerate
Hmm.
for the sake of the American empire? It seems like now, early on, that it seems easy, that none of the real economic effects have been felt in any great sense yet. They seem rather eager to go on with it. But over the next several weeks, months, and if not years, will they be as eager? We already saw breaking of rank throughout the past 8 years since the sanctions were placed over the Crimea annexation. We saw
Hmm.
countries like Hungary, Italy, Germany break ranks on that. Again, those countries that were involved in wanting to keep them on SWIFT. Even France toted around it. Now, they did comply. Macron has been trying to be this voice of European unity to varying degrees of success, but when you do see that, although it's early on, against 5 days, I think people will keep on forgetting that we're less than a week into this conflict, we're less than a week into this crisis, that the question of Europe is going to be the preeminent question out of all of this. Russia could declare victory tomorrow and take Kiev, whatever, the most
Hmm.
exaggerated example on that side, or they could go running with their tail in between their legs and be completely humiliated. Putin gets removed from office, whatever. But that won't change the fact this recent event, despite the negative feelings toward Russia, has fundamentally driven a wedge in between Europe and the States. And you also have this weird inversion where you have several European countries which are being more hawkish on this, wanting to deliver jets to Ukraine, where America hasn't stopped supporting Ukraine, but they've been quiet about it. They've already stated that they're not willing to go to war over Ukraine.
Yeah.
So we do see that, where it also is, as I was saying at the beginning of the episode, wanting to pawn off those responsibility upon the Europeans who have enjoyed several decades of American security guarantees, and I can't imagine they would take too kindly to that. But possibly the biggest news out of the European Union and NATO was Turkey not only blocked
Mm.
access of the Straits, the Bosphorus Straits, to Russian warships, but to all warships, taking a very neutral stance in it, that they won't let the Russian ships that are outside of the Black Sea back in, but they're not going to let in any American, British, French, or any other fleets. And it seems like Turkey is walking this tightrope more than
I
ever
gotta hand
before.
it to him.
Yes, and it's really a move that Erdogan would pull. And who would have thought one of the most brazen moves he could pull was neutrality? But I suppose in a
Yes.
time like this, that's uh, that's the sort of world that we are living in
He
now.
astonishes me.
Yes, again, I think what you will about the man personally, think about what you will about the nation of Turkey personally. I frankly have very negative opinions on both, but yes, he is an astonishing figure, and I do think he's a good template for right-wing figures. I will say that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
If
Good
more
point.
European countries, if more Anglosphere countries had men like Erdogan in power, I think we would be in much better places. Men who actually do seem pragmatic about their position, who do seem, again, have some degree of care and affection for their country and their countrymen. So, again, I'll give Erdogan all the credit in the abstract, despite whatever I feel about him personally. I can separate the man from his methods.
Hmm.
But
Yeah.
with that being said, he's possibly kneecapped a major effort of NATO in order to escalate this conflict. In which case, even despite my opinions, I do think the world does owe him somewhat of a thanks for preventing such a brazen increase in escalation. Now, will that last? I imagine that will gain the ire of the Western sphere of, say, the State Department or, again, any other Western country and their various modes of operation, much more than it will the Russians.
Yeah.
I'm sure the Russians aren't happy having their ships in the Mediterranean blocked out of the Black Sea, but they'll take it if it means not having American ships or British ships or French ships in the Black Sea. So, again, I can only imagine the internal operations against Erdogan may kick up a notch as they have been for the past few years. You could say ever since the 2016 coup attempt, but especially upon the most recent economic crisis with Turkey.
Hmm.
So, once again, to continue this operation, they may have to open another front, most likely metaphorically, but also very slim chance realistically, against Turkey in order to even enforce this. Turkey, which is supposed to be a NATO member, which is supposed to be standing strong in the bloc for this. Now, keep in mind, last week we were covering how Erdogan was brazenly denouncing the Russian intervention and saying that they should be off sovereign territory, meanwhile occupying northern Cyprus themselves as well as their interventions in Syria, Armenia, Libya, etc.
Hmm.
But point being is that's the nature of Erdogan. Last week it's that. This week it's he's blocking the straits to anyone.
Yes, and it could be that he's had very bad economic woes the last 6 months, as we've discussed. I think the thing about war is investors start to speculate, they start to get nervous, and there's countries that don't have the kind of buffer to deal with those scenarios. And I think it was also, you could look at it as him returning the favor, basically because Putin saved his ass in 2016 against the Obama coup against him. And you could also look at it as him, doing what needs to be done to make sure that his country economically can weather what is happening, um, because it's a much more fragile economy, and he doesn't want to deal with ships, arguments about why are you letting this guy but not that guy come through, and so on and so on. Um, so I think it was actually a really shrewd and smart move. And speaking of other fronts, Kosovo has asked for membership of NATO. I don't know if it's fake or not, but I saw one headline about nukes and just outrageous stuff, but definitely the one about joining NATO. Now I think it's very, very likely in the next 5 to 10 years, maybe sooner, that there will be another Balkan war, because Serbia is in a very similar position that Russia is completely surrounded now, and Kosovo joining NATO would press the issue in Kosovo. It would press the issue for um, Serbia to react. So it would be a way to demoralize Serbia, and at the same time surround it even more, right? Which is essentially the scenario that has been playing out in Russia for the last 25 years. It could also be tempting for the Americans to do that now when Russia is more occupied. Serbia, essentially, being neutral, has placed itself next to Russia with what is going on. Even Georgia is not going to sanction Russia. And of course, there's still India, China, Brazil. There is at least a little more than half the population of the world, and these areas that are now far, far, far more developed than they were even 30 years ago, let alone 50 years ago. So, Russia will have to find ways to strategize with them in terms of their economy. And interest rates are now at 20%, which have skyrocketed, and that is there to stop from inflation increasing. But at the same time, the ruble has plummeted. However, Russia makes about $750 million a day from gas. It might be gas or it might be oil and gas with just Europe. And so essentially what's happening is Russia is selling the oil at a higher cost with a ruble that is returning more money in. And so, at the moment, I'm not saying it's to be overly optimistic for Russia here. There's Sberbank, which is a bank subsidiary of the Russia's state bank. There's another subsidiary of that bank in Europe, and that one I think has closed. I'm not sure, but I saw it was open, then it was closed. But Sberbank in Russia is actually working, and of course, Russia does have their own domestic SWIFT alternative system that they've been using for 2 years, and Citibank, and it might be Morgan Stanley is another American institution. There are other banking institutions from around the world that are already working in that. And China's has a SWIFT alternative already as well, and it's booming right now. And of course, Gazprom signed another huge gas deal with China. Because I think one of the things, maybe, I don't know, I can't recall whether we specified this or not, but Nord Stream 2 was not going to deliver more gas to Europe. It was going to deliver gas to Europe almost entirely through the North Sea, and it was not going to go through Ukraine anymore. That was the point of it. But they weren't going to get more gas. They just were not going to get the same amount of gas a different way.
Certainly, and there's not really much more I could add on to that without being superfluous. So, just moving on from that, one of the last things I did want to address in terms of just this episode, I did allude to it earlier in the episode, was about the situation in Ukraine itself with the minority populations. And we did touch on this a bit earlier, where, again, although they don't have that many numbers, what will the impact of the Polish, the Romanian, and the Hungarian, particularly the Romanian and the Hungarian diaspora, be in terms of this conflict? I'm thinking of particularly the Hungarian diaspora, because the only country so far in Europe, even outside of the European Union, that hasn't agreed to sanction on Russia has been Serbia, to nobody's surprise.
Mm-hmm.
And the question is, Orban has given his passing support to Ukraine throughout the conflict, but he's always been hesitant because of that situation with the diaspora population. And I'm not saying that it is enough tipped scales, but between all the different factors, with Hungary's discontent with the European Union, their close relationship with Russia, and their diaspora population, I could see them being no surprise, a major voice of dissent, with Orban being a major voice of dissent. Now, he is coming up on an election in a few months here, so that is something to consider. So perhaps the rhetoric is being tempered by Orban and Fidesz at this time, but it does make you wonder that although there are several countries in Europe, particularly Eastern Europe, that do not like Russia at all, that doesn't mean all their historical and even contemporary issues with Ukraine have been absolved. Plenty of them also have outstanding issues with Ukraine. Now, those have been temporarily put aside, primarily at the behest of Washington and Brussels, in order to counter the so-called greater Russian threat. But the question is, as time goes on, we've already seen a bit of this will these countries' conflicting interests with Ukraine eventually overtake it? Because with Russia, there is that degree of distance, there is that degree of separation. Although they may have an intense dislike, even a fear of, say, invasion, maybe in the case of the Baltic states or Poland. Now, however justified that fear may be, that's beside the point. And especially with the possibility of Ukraine getting a fast track membership to the European Union they already have, and if with the possibility of that membership also being fast tracked with their acceptance in there, will that also bring up the outstanding issues with Ukraine? Now, I'm hesitant to make any definitive predictions at this point, but I do think a lot of people, regardless of their take on the conflict, do overlook that Ukraine isn't, I wouldn't say, a reviled nation, but they certainly have the problems with other neighbors as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot to consider. I do think, in another era, I think a lot could have, would have been possible. I just think at this moment, like what you're seeing is the exception to the rule, and the exception always proves who is actually in power and the extent of their power. And I think you can see which countries are maybe less loyal to the U.S., but you can see all of them, when need be, will be forced to be loyal to the U.S. And the U.S. won't tolerate any of this. They will not tolerate any change in borders, no matter how much their allies want it. In fact, yeah, that's I see, and I'm not implying that you saw a chance either. But I see no chance. I know. I think, with some people, they are thinking about those things because Europeans they're very historically minded, and territory that they lost 3, 4, 500 years ago, they still think about ways to get it back, even though the demographic there has changed or whatnot. They still lament the loss of that. Europe is it's an extremely, extremely competitive zone. It's one of the reasons why America could never occur in Europe, is because it's so competitive. No one can ever fully succeed.
And
Um,
I will concur with you with what you're saying that at this time, at this place, the American
but
Empire
later on, yeah.
still has hegemony and will enforce that hegemony. But as it slips, and I think a
Hmm.
major consequence of this conflict will be that slipping hegemony, I do believe it will reopen many old wounds for many different countries.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm
Absolutely.
talking
They
about things
are
that are
thinking about
completely
that.
unrelated to each other. I'm talking about and I'm not saying it's going to be another continent-wide conflict on Europe, but I could see the souring relations even among even Western European countries with each other at that point. Because again, as you were saying, while Germans and French, to take the most historical example, at least in the mind of a Westerner, may not want to take up arms and fight each other at this point, while their governments may get along well, while their people may not even hold a lot of those animosities, a lot of that is, again, thanks to the American Empire for the past 75, almost 80 years at this point, enforcing that hegemony over Europe. And you want to take an even more, let's just say, volatile example, maybe say even a Greece and Turkey, where they have almost come close to trading blows, or a France and Turkey, where you have seen France play into those dynamics before. But point being is, the American Empire, I believe, is using its slipping power in order to maintain a, say, united front in Europe for the time being. But I suppose the other $1 million question is, how long will that last?
Yeah, I mean, because I think, the strategy that Putin is using here, and let me know if I'm repeating myself, but the strategy that he's using here, I think, is based on like the outcome of Afghanistan. There was all like the media kept telling you it's not going to fall. It's not going to fall. They reassured you. They took forces out, and then suddenly they had to return forces back in, even more than they had taken out. Right. And at one point it was untenable. So it spiraled out of control, and what can I say? The rest is history. They have it collapsed, and I think Putin's game basically is to use his line from that speech, "An empire of lies," is that reality eventually will hit these ridiculous um, soft power narratives, and you already have a foretaste of that with Afghanistan, even the truckers to a lesser degree, but to a much lesser degree, uh, demonstrate this, right? But especially Afghanistan, and you can see some of the panic. Yes, some of it is social media. That's what happens. People who are addicted to the dopamine that social media gives you. But the panic is based in some reality there, even though it's expressed with like a kind of comic book interpretation of the world. And I think he knows that eventually, like when that bubble pops, it will be extraordinary, right? That will, at that moment when that happens, there will be incredible amounts of disillusionment.
Yes, I will bring this up since you did mention the soft power, but I do think looking at the reaction to this, at least in the short term, the American empire still does have a massive reserve of soft power left that is able to use to enforce the narratives that so many people across the world will fall in line with it. And I wouldn't go as far as somebody say like a Soldo, regardless of again what you may think of him personally. I think he has some pretty good takes on things, especially this way. He still maintains that America maintains something of a hyperpower that will not be dislodged anytime soon. Now that could just be pessimism on his part, which again I can only speak to what I've read of the guy. I don't know him personally or anything, so take it with a grain of salt. But I have seen that argument crop up that there may be more gas left in the tank for the American Empire than I think people realize. I think that even we realize.
Yeah, yeah. I think I think it was on the Duran. They said he was asked, this process is going to kick off, Cold War II probably, and it will isolate Russia from the West, but it won't isolate Russia from the world, and it will deter the encroachment of the West upon Russia. Um, but as long as there is America, there will be an American dollar. But the de-dollarization will continue. It has to continue. There are countries now that, they're young. Even their parents were not there. They have no recollection of World War II. Um, there's no moving forward for them if they constantly have to deal with America. And China won't be the only country. Like China itself can be like another place where other countries, of course, within China, are can find ways to succeed that they normally could not with America, right? Because there's many of these countries that do not want the kind of cultural imperatives that America would force in order to use American dollars, right? Because that the atomization of the public is part and parcel with the type of capitalism that America works with, right? That goes hand in hand, right? And you can see it in Ukraine. You can find photos of Ukrainians doing the whatever the leather sex shit with dressing up as dogs and stuff. I remember I saw some photos the other day. It's turbo America. It's turbo Westernism. So
Yeah, that day's coming, but as long as it's in America and the efforts to keep America together in order to have confidence in the dollar, no matter how many trillions it's in debt, like that effort to keep America together in order to have confidence in the dollar is, I think, going to be one of the theaters to watch. There's going to be more drama, as we said way back in 2020. From now on, there will be more division, not less division. And these short-term gains where the right wing unifies with trans concerns by living whatever vicariously, like, oh wow, I could because Ukraine is sort of like, you could do things there that you could never do in America, right? And but it's only within this little narrow window. As soon as you go back, that's not the case. For Europe, I think it is a U.S. strategy to reduce the amount of fuel. So the future will be with people. People won't have as many cars. There will be electric cars, but I don't think that many people will be able to afford a car. And that is a geopolitical strategy, because you saw that they would not have the big swift sanctions that they promised, which would affect gas. That you know they're not going to do that. So long-term goal, they have to keep going on with the climate change narrative, and just get people to not use gas. But this will cause a decline in Europe as well.
Oh, certainly. And again, you could once again argue that it is part of a occupation strategy for Europe that's part of keeping them under the thumb of the American Empire,
Hmm.
at least in the short term. Now, how that will pay off long term, I don't know. I don't see it playing well in the long term, which I would say is probably the summary of this entire recent paradigm that has cropped up in the wake of the invasion. That short term, I think the American Empire and its vassals have won, even if Russia does accomplish all of its war goals in Ukraine, whatever those may be. But in the long term, they are expending everything they have for this victory. And for the very ham fisted example, to reference the vaunted World War II, similar to the British Empire in the 20th century, where they're expending all their imperial resources on one project, that is defeating the
Mm.
Germans, in both world wars for that matter, while at the same time frittering everything away that makes it an empire.
Right. Those are excellent points, and you can see that in all these options about what to do next, right? Like, y- you know, no one expected, I think, Americans to say, yeah, we're going to do nukes. And that's, I mean, I know they're suggesting military intervention as a possibility was higher. I get that. But 42% for nuclear exchanges is really, I mean, what's left? It's already over at that point. So in a sense, I think there's a kind of a futility. Um, that strange kind of will to power that we've seen in America, where they will fabricate lies, they will make excuses that, the narrative does have a useful purpose, but we've seen it in other scenarios where it doesn't. It's just there to help, a lot of these blue check marks achieve power. They're very cynical about it, and so in a way, it shouldn't surprise us that 42% of the American public should say, oh yeah, if Russia succeeds, we should nuke them, right? Because they're not thinking clearly, and they're not thinking clearly because they feel weak, and I think it's the shock from Afghanistan, and the sort of gradual retreat, the kind of consolidation that has to take place. But I think for Europe now, I think efforts to liberalize Hungary and Poland will actually increase, not decrease, when this war is over. Because it will be a very, very different world when this war is over.
Yes, like I said, Russia could completely fail and run away its tail between its legs. Putin gets removed from power. All the uh, all the greatest dreams of the neoconservative establishment, let's put it that way. And the damage that this war has done on the global order is irreparable. More irreparable than even, say, Syria. And Syria was probably the most pivotal conflict before this, and who knows, at this rate, it may eclipse the importance of Assyria in that context, because, once again, we saw the failure of the American Empire to dislodge a Middle Eastern regime, and perhaps the failure of the American Empire to really assert itself in Europe in any long-term and meaningful sense will eclipse that even more, which I am tempted to say. And then, of course, that's not even getting the speculations of what the future of East Asia has in store in regard to the China-Taiwan question, which, of course, people have speculated that. I still maintain that Taiwan will not be taken by force, but rather by soft power. Eventually, if they do capitulate, they will do so bloodlessly as well, because I don't think there's that strong of a national identity in Taiwan that is that opposed to it. In fact, I believe that the party that is more sympathetic to China is currently doing better in the polls right now. Correct me if I'm wrong, but there is a pro-unification party, for lack of a better term, that does operate out of Taiwan. That so we could see that, and the history and the disparity between Russia and Ukraine and the former Soviet Union or former Russian Empire is vastly different than the dynamic between mainland China and the island of Taiwan. So we will see how that plays out, but that's also another area to keep your eye on. And things have been, relatively quiet in the Middle East beyond, of course, Russia revoking its recognition of both the of the Golan Heights, of the Israeli control over the Golan Heights, as I believe we mentioned last episode. So there was that as well, and just because it isn't obligatory mention at this point, last number of Idlib, I do believe, especially with all the international chaos, is especially on track. Even without the Russian support. Now, the Russian support will make it. The lack of Russian support may make it harder if they do have to withdraw support in light of a greater conflict. But the American Empire, the current world order, could not care less about these rebel holdouts in Syria, especially at this point. So I do think Idlib is good as done before the end of summer.
Well, actually, militants from Syria are already going into Ukraine.
I guess
to fight with all the base battalions.
Yes, I guess you have to go where work is. We've seen them go to war zones in Libya, in Armenia. So I suppose the next logical progression, isn't it? We'll be seeing former Syrian militants in every conflict to come for the rest of their lives, won't we?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think fourth generational warfare basically implies like a grinding down, a constant warfare. There's even a kind of a policing quality. Like you see these videos, like you see this crazy Ukrainian woman who's got a Molotov cocktail, and she tries to throw it at one of these armored carriers that look like a tank without like the big turret. And part of it hits the vehicle, the military vehicle, and part of it spills like into the car.
Oh, Kerosene Kelly.
Yeah, Kerosene Kelly. It's just it's ridiculous, right? But it just looks weak. I mean, it just like they're just ignoring them. And I've seen stuff where they try to do like the whole, everybody loves the defiant girl, the little defiant girl, like on Wall Street. Which, of course, was something that took place in Palestine. But anyways, that was doctored. But yeah, it's kind of funny, really. But it's a kind of a policing action. They yell at them as if they were, cops at a protest. It doesn't come off like I mean, it's an incursion, much more so than an invasion.
Oh, certainly, I would certainly agree with that. But with the question of fourth generation warfare, I won't drag this on too long. But with my tongue-in-cheek comment that was only slightly tongue-in-cheek about the Syrian fighters migrating for work, I do believe that these sort of conflicts will create a professional nomadic warrior class that, again,
Yes.
just serves as mercenaries. No real ideological motivation, just whoever is paying top dollar for them to fight. And that we're looking at fun. I don't think this is going to completely replace the, say, third and a half generation warfare, which is why I would put Ukraine at right now. But I do think it's introduced this whole new dynamic, something that's almost medieval, where you just have these traveling bands of mercenaries who can be recruited to fight in any such war anywhere in the world.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, don't even get started on the dreaded Wagner group. We all know that they're the true masterminds behind what's happening in Ukraine right now.
Yes,
That's
yes.
that's what they don't tell you. At the personal behest of Alexander Dugin himself. Believe it or not, you see, we've cracked this mystery, we've cracked this riddle, and that's why you tune in to every episode of the War Report. And
What you just said reminded me of something. The guy below Shoigu, that general has been fired. So it very well may be that the decision has been made for Russia to, go more whole hog into it to speed up the war, because I think it's creating a kind of anxiety everywhere, and I think there is a real chance that could, in Russia, the anxiety might become unbearable. Um, and there'll be efforts by media to make it unbearable. Anyhow, you just reminded me of it.
yeah, and we'll be certain to cover that whenever we do our next episode, which will probably be in a couple days here. Now, I know
Hmm.
most, if not all, of what you said what we said, I should say, will probably be outdated by the time you guys watch this in just less than 24 hours. But that's why we try to paint with broad brushstrokes here, not getting anything too particular. So, if anything is outdated, just keep in mind that, of course, we don't do this live, we do this the night before. So, we may not be privy to all the information that may happen after the show. Now, of course, we'll try to come back and update with every respective episode as we do. But yeah, just let us know if you can find anything that is pertinent, anything that we should cover in regard to this conflict, because this is such a all-encompassing thing. I'm interested to get my hands on whatever I can. So if there's anything in particular that you saw that you think is show-worthy, just either comment it or get into. You guys probably know how to get in touch with me, and I'll be certain to get it on here and again just give this massive story the coverage it deserves. So, with that being said, we will see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Take care, guys.